Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua, with Dr. Daniel Cantey. As the modern order enters its apparent sunset, Dr. Cantey looks anew at the ancient scriptures to learn what they teach about man and his world. Here he is with today's episode.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Old Testament and the New Man. My name is Daniel Cantey. Today we're going to be going over Leviticus chapters 11 through 27, and the title of the lecture is Clean and Unclean, Holy and Unholy. So we're going to be talking about the major themes in these particular chapters, and I'm going to do the best that I can. I haven't known too many people who get really excited about lectures on Leviticus, but I'm going to do my best to make it interesting to everybody and to unlock, I hope, some of the key themes that are at work in these particular chapters, and hopefully we'll get a good look at the inner workings of some of them and some of the questions that they raise, while also seeing what the fathers have to say, particularly about notions of clean and unclean. Before we get into it, though, I want to say that there are portions of this lecture that are probably not suitable for younger children. So if you have toddler-age children or elementary-age children at least, you may want to listen to this lecture by yourself and figure out whether or not you think it's appropriate for them. Because there is material in these sections of Leviticus that is pretty adult by our standards. And so I think you would want to take that into consideration as a parent. So, now diving in. Leviticus 11 through 15 covers clean and unclean, so we'll start with that particular division. Then Leviticus 17 through 27 is known as the Holiness Code and covers what is holy, how it is that Israel is supposed to be holy. Between them is Leviticus 16, which describes the Day of Atonement, what Jews today know as Yom Kippur. So we'll be talking about clean and unclean, then about the Day of Atonement, and then we'll finish by talking over the Holiness Code. Now, as we move through this material, there will be questions, at least for some of it, of how they are applied, how different teachings, rather, are applied in our day. And I'm so thankful that we have the fathers for this, to give us the pattern or show us the relevance that passages can have for us when, on the surface of it, there's a pretty good amount of distance between what's going on with us and what was going on in ancient Israel. So we'll get to that here just in a couple of minutes. So we'll see that at work. But I want to begin here with a kind of summary statement, a summary passage that we see in Leviticus chapter 10. And here the words are being spoken to priests, but they have to do more generally with what's going on in Leviticus. And here it says, "Do not drink wine and strong drink, you nor your sons with you." This is talking to Aaron and his sons, the priests. "When you go into the tabernacle of testimony, or when you approach the altar, lest you die." And here's really the key part. "That you may distinguish between holy and unholy, and between unclean and clean. And that you may teach the children of Israel all the ordinances which the Lord spoke to them by the hand of Moses." So here is what Aaron and the priests are supposed to do. Distinguish between holy and unholy, between unclean and clean. And this, again, maps what is going to happen for much of the rest of Leviticus. It serves as a kind of thesis statement, if you will, for much of what is going to follow. And so this provides a kind of rubric for how we look at the rest of the text. Now, as far as the fathers interpreting things for us, and as far as certain transformations that happen between the way things were seen in ancient Israel and the way they were practiced and the way that we practice them in the church today, I want to step back a little bit so that we can have an instructive example. This, again, is still in Leviticus chapter 10, and this is the brief story of Nadab and Abihu. Chapter 10, verse 1. "Now Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's sons, each took his censer and put fire in it, put incense on it, and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. So fire went out from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. Now Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's sons, who were priests, offered this strange fire. And we don't know what this strange fire is. It's not told to us in any kind of explicit way. We don't know exactly what they did wrong. So it's distant from us in that sense. Today, as far as I'm aware at least, our priests do not have the possibility of offering a literal kind of strange fire. That's not really what we offer. People may burn incense. But there seems to be no equivalent on the literal level to what is happening here in ancient Israel. So thankfully, we have an interpretation from St. Irenaeus that interprets this for us and that makes it relevant, that applies it for us in the church. So here I'm going to read from St. Irenaeus. Quote, "Wherefore it is incumbent to obey the priests who are in the church, those who, as I have shown, possess the succession of the episcopate, have received the certain gift of truth according to the good pleasure of the Father. But it is also incumbent to hold in suspicion others who depart from the primitive succession and assemble themselves together in any place whatsoever, looking upon them either as heretics of perverse minds, or as schismatics puffed up and self-pleasing, or again as hypocrites, acting thus for the sake of lucre and vainglory. For all these have fallen from the truth. And the heretics, indeed, who bring strange fire to the altar of God, namely strange doctrines, shall be burned up by the fire from heaven, as were Nadab and Abihu." So there's your interpretation. What does it mean for us today in the church to have strange fire? Well, rather than being literal fire, it now becomes strange doctrines. Doctrines that are twisted or perverted away from the path of God, away from the path that the church has maintained for us over the centuries, if not the millennia, of its existence. So strange fire for ancient Israelites, strange doctrines for us. And we'll see that happen again when we get to clean and unclean and we see how the fathers interpret it for us. It's important to recall here that holy and unholy, clean and unclean, these are dividing lines. They're boundary markers on behavior, moral behavior and ritual behavior. And so we're going to be seeing what is good and what is not good, what you avoid and what is permitted, or in some cases you might say blessed, what is blessed and what is not blessed, what you are allowed to do, what you are not allowed to do. And behind all of this, there is an exhortation that we will see periodically in the book of Leviticus. "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." This is God's call to his people Israel, and by extension to us in the church. "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." So we'll come back to this in several places here in the text. Now, beginning with clean and unclean, Leviticus 11 through 15, I'm going to read some passages so we'll get a feel for the text and how it's working. Again, it will raise questions in places that it doesn't exactly answer for us. And we have certain categories of things that submit to this division of clean and unclean. So what is it that makes something unclean? What is the distinction between clean and unclean? Well, let's see what Leviticus has to say. The first category, or the first area where this division is applied, has to do with diet, with dietary restrictions. So there are animals that are clean to eat and animals that are unclean. For example, chapter 11, verse 1. "Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, These are the animals you may eat among all the animals on the earth. Whatever divides the hoof, having cloven hooves, and chewing the cud, that you may eat. Nevertheless, these you shall not eat among those that chew the cud or have cloven hooves. The camel, the rock hyrax, the hare, the swine, these are examples of things that you cannot eat, even though they meet the proper distinctions. So on the one hand, those who divide the hoof and chew the cud, you can eat these. You can't eat any that don't. Verse 9, these you may eat, of everything in the water. Whatever in the water has fins and scales, whether in the seas or in the rivers, that you may eat. So fins and scales is good. But everything in the water or in the seas or the rivers that does not have fins and scales, from all these, and from every living creature in the water which the waters produce, they are an abomination to you. They shall be an abomination to you. You shall not eat their flesh, but you shall regard their carcasses as an abomination. So if it has fins and scales, again, it is good. Anything without fins and scales is not good. in fact, is an abomination. You shall have nothing to do with it. Verse 20. Now all flying insects that creep on all fours shall be an abomination to you. Yet these you may eat of every flying insect that creeps on all fours, those which have jointed legs above their feet with which to leap on the earth. So you can eat the locust after its kind, the destroying locust after its kind, the cricket and the grasshopper after their kind. But all other flying insects you will not eat. So some of them are clean, some of them, most of them, are unclean. And so we see these dividing lines with the animals on the earth, with the fish in the sea, with the insects. There are other categories with birds, for example, but there are divisions here. And we don't really know what it is that makes one animal clean and another animal unclean. Why is it, for example, that lambs are clean and swine are unclean? Why is it that dividing the hoof and chewing the cud are the distinguishing factors? Why is that the case? Well, we'll see a little bit later on what St. Augustine has to say about that and what St. Clement has to say about that. But on the surface of it, it's really hard for us to say why one and not the other. We don't really know. Towards the end of this chapter, however, we meet the first instance of the exhortation that I pointed out just a few moments ago about holiness. This is chapter 11, verse 44. God says, I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore sanctify yourselves, and you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Neither shall you defile your souls with any creeping thing that creeps on the earth, for I am the Lord who brings you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I, the Lord, am holy. And then in verse 47, you are to distinguish between the clean and the unclean, between the animal that may be eaten and the animal that may not be eaten. And so these dietary restrictions, as mysterious as they are to us, they are clearly in the text part of what it is that makes Israel holy to God. That if Israel is going to be holy, it is at least in part by following these rules. These are part of the way that God has made Israel separate, a special and designated people for himself. Okay, so the second example of clean and unclean has to do with purification after childbirth. We're moving ahead to Leviticus 12 here. For a male child, after the childbirth, a woman is unclean for 40 days. For a female child, she is unclean for 80 days. And at the end of her period of purification, she must bring sacrifices to make atonement, and then she is clean after that. Well, what is it that makes her unclean, we might ask? It has to do with the flow of blood during childbirth. She will continue, this is chapter 12, verse 4, she will continue in the blood of her uncleanness 33 days. This is the description of the part of the period of purification for the male child. So the blood of her uncleanness, that's what makes her unclean. Or, for example, again, this is a little bit later, verse 6, when the days of her purification are fulfilled, whether for a son or a daughter, she is to bring to the priest a lamb of the first year as a whole burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove as a sin offering to the door of the tabernacle of testimony. Then he, the priest, shall bring it before the Lord and make atonement for her, and it will cleanse her from her flow of blood. So it's the flow of blood, evidently during the actual labor, from which she needs to be cleansed. So the priest will make atonement for her, and she will be clean. So here we have a second instance of what it is that makes one unclean, and how it is that one is to be cleansed through sacrifices and the passage of time, either 40 days or 80 days. A third example is leprosy, a contagious disease of the skin. So we'll start here in Leviticus chapter 13, verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a man has a scar on the surface of his skin or a shiny spot, and it appears to be a leprous infection, he is to be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons, the priests. The priest shall examine the infection on the surface of his skin, and if the hair in the infection has turned white, and the infection appears deeper than the surface of his skin, it is a leprous infection. Thus the priest shall examine him and pronounce him unclean. The rest of this chapter has other means of diagnosing whether or not a person has leprosy. So verse 8, if the priest sees the spot, and the spot has indeed spread on the skin, the priest shall pronounce the man unclean. It is leprosy. On the other hand, if someone doesn't have leprosy, this is chapter 13, verse 38. If a man or a woman has bright spots on the skin of the body, specifically shining white spots, the priest shall look. And indeed, if the bright spots on the skin of the body are shining white spots, it is eczema. He is clean. So leprosy is unclean, eczema is clean. Now, the consequences of having leprosy are really quite stark for the person who has it. So in chapter 13, verse 45, now the clothes of the leper on whom the infection is shall be torn, and his head uncovered, and he shall cover his mouth, and he shall be called unclean. He shall be unclean. All the days he has the infection, he shall be unclean. He is unclean, and he shall dwell apart. His way of life shall be outside the camp. So if you have this particular sickness, you are set out, as it were. You are driven away from others. And we see this repetition in this short passage of uncleanness, which is mentioned several times. All the days that you have the infection, you are unclean, and you shall dwell apart from others. Now, there are remaining chapters here, remaining sections on laws concerning leprous garments, on processes of purification for healed lepers, on laws concerning leprous houses. So the attention to leprosy is pretty thorough here in Leviticus. One of the things that's interesting here is that when we talk about the processes for healing, or for purifying rather, the healed leper, this is chapter 14, verse 4. The priest shall give orders to take for the one declared clean 2 small birds, live and clean, and also cedar wood and scarlet and hyssop. And the fact that hyssop is used should remind us of David's psalm, Psalm 51, where he says, "Cleanse me with hyssop, and I shall be made clean." Leprosy is a type or a symbol of sin in the Old Testament. And so to say, "Cleanse me with hyssop," is a part of the process for cleansing and purification from leprosy. And leprosy, again, is identified with sin more generally, and we see a pretty strong preoccupation with leprosy in chapters 13 and 14 of Leviticus. So there's a great deal of attention that's paid to it here. The last category that we see for clean and unclean has to do with bodily discharges, and at this point, if you have small children, you may want to skip the next couple of minutes because some of this is fairly adult to be discussing. So chapter 15, as far as men are concerned, 15 verse 2, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, to any and every man, when any man has a seminal discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. Every bed on which he who has the discharge lies is unclean, and everything on which he sits shall be unclean. Whoever touches anything under him shall be unclean until evening, and whoever carries any of those things shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until the evening. Now when he who has a discharge is cleansed of his discharge, he shall count for himself 7 days for his cleansing." And this is talking about the emission of semen. So this type of discharge makes one unclean. On the other hand, for women, it is the menstrual period which makes them unclean. So chapter 15, verse 19. "If a woman has a discharge, and the discharge from her body is blood, she shall be in her menstrual period 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. Everything she lies on during her menstruation shall be unclean, also everything she sits on shall be unclean. If any man lies with her, and her uncleanness is on him, he shall be unclean for 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days other than at the time of her menstruation, or if it runs beyond this time, all the days of her unclean discharge shall be as the days of her menstruation. She shall be unclean." And there's a kind of summary statement at the end of the chapter. "Thus you shall make the children of Israel ungodly because of their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness when they defile my tabernacle among them. This is the law for one who has a discharge and who emits semen and is unclean thereby, and for her who is indisposed because of her menstrual period, and for one who has a discharge, either man or woman, and for the man who lies with her during her menstrual period. That's the concluding word on this particular division between clean and unclean. I want to point out here, chapter 15, verse 31, "You shall make the children of Israel ungodly because of their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness when they defile my tabernacle among them." When we think about these categories of clean and unclean, holy and unholy, the categories that are really to be kept apart are holy and unclean. Obviously, holy and unholy are opposites, but the unclean cannot come into contact with what is holy. In the same way that the unholy profanes what is holy, the unclean also profanes what is holy. If you are to go before God, you are to purify yourself. That means you are both to set yourself apart as holy, and you are to adhere to the laws of cleanness. And if you are unclean, you do not go before God, not until you have achieved or regained the state of cleanliness do you go before God. So, we have four different categories of clean and unclean. Those two descriptions are applied in four different ways. First, the dietary restrictions. Second, purification after childbirth. Third, leprosy, a particular kind of contagious disease. And lastly, bodily discharges. So these are the four ways. And, well, is there anything that connects all four of them? I'm not really sure that there's anything that connects all four of them. We can look at three of the four and say that there is some kind of expenditure or loss of life or threat to life. So, for example, if the life is in the blood, which Leviticus says the life is in the blood, and we're talking about a loss of blood, well, that requires purification. That could make one unclean, that there has been this loss of life that it, for whatever reason, is deemed unclean. And we see that in the loss of blood for the woman after childbirth. We see that in the menstrual discharge for the woman. We see that in the flow of semen for the man, that if the semen is judged to be life-giving as part of procreation, then there is a loss of life. There's a threat to life when it comes to leprosy, when it comes to sickness, even though it's, again, a question, why this particular disease and no other? Why this particular one? So in 3 out of the 4, there at least could be an argument made that there is some sort of loss of life or some sort of threat to life that ties them together in terms of physical sickness or in terms of the expenditure of bodily fluids. So those things could be held together. On the other hand, the dietary restrictions have no clear connection with that. Again, why one set of animals and not another set of animals? Why are some things clean and other things not clean? We don't really know unless we adhere to some sort of symbolic interpretation, which we're going to see in just a moment with St. Augustine. But before we get to St. Augustine, I'd like to read a New Testament perspective on clean and unclean. This comes from Mark chapter 7, and this is our Lord the Christ talking to the people about clean and unclean. And this is in the context of discussions of washing hands and having clean pitchers and cups and that sort of thing in Jesus' discussion with the Pharisees. So in chapter 7, verse 14, when Jesus had called all the multitude to himself, he said to them, "Hear me, everyone, and understand. There is nothing that enters a man from outside which can defile him, but the things which come out of him, those are the things that defile a man. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear." When he had entered a house away from the crowd, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. So he said to them, "Are you thus without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from outside cannot defile him, because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated, thus purifying all foods? And he said, what comes out of a man, that defiles a man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile a man." And so the shift in the New Testament from the Old Testament is away from bodily realities, or we might say bodily fluids or things that you eat. It's away from the concern with the body and more directly on the concern with the heart. It is that which is in the heart and proceeds out of us that makes us clean or unclean. Do we seek the things of God? Do we pursue righteousness? And do we behave in such a way as to reflect that? Does our heart pour out the things that are wise, the things that are holy, the things that are clean? Or does it pour out those things that are foolish and unclean? Again, evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, and the like. What is it that comes out of us? That is the judgment of clean and unclean, not whether we have washed our hands or whether we have eaten or not eaten a particular animal, say. Now, continuing along this line, let's hear what St. Augustine has to say to us about clean and unclean. This comes from Contra Faustum, Book 6, paragraph 7. This is a rather long quote, but I think it goes a long way towards showing us how it is that the fathers interpreted these kinds of passages. He writes, "The Old Testament calls some animals unclean, not in their nature, but symbolically, on account of the prefigurative character of that dispensation. For instance, a pig and a lamb are both clean in their nature, for every creature of God is good. But symbolically, a lamb is clean and a pig unclean. So the words wise and fool are both clean in their nature, as words composed of letters. But fool may be called symbolically unclean, because it means an unclean thing. Perhaps the pig is the same among symbols as a fool is among real things. The animal and the 4 letters which compose the word may mean the same thing. No doubt the animal is pronounced unclean by the law because it does not chew the cud, which is not a fault, but its nature. But the men of whom this animal is a symbol are unclean, not by nature, but from their own fault, because though they gladly hear the words of wisdom, they never reflect on them afterwards. For to recall in quiet repose some useful instruction from the stomach of memory to the mouth of reflection is a kind of spiritual rumination. The animals above mentioned are a symbol of those people who do not do this." And I'm going to stop here for just a moment. So the pig is the fool. The pig does not chew the cud, which means that he does not ruminate on the words of wisdom in moments of quiet reflection. He doesn't concentrate or go over or meditate on the words of the scripture that guide to life. Continuing on with St. Augustine, "And the prohibition of the flesh of these animals, that is, of the pig, is a warning against this fault. Another passage of Scripture speaks of the precious treasure of wisdom and describes ruminating as clean and not ruminating as unclean. Proverbs 21:20, quote, 'A precious treasure rests in the mouth of a wise man, but a foolish man swallows it up,' end quote. Symbols of this kind, St. Augustine continues, either in words or in things, give useful and pleasant exercise to intelligent minds in the way of inquiry and comparison. But formerly, people were required not only to hear, but to practice many such things. For at that time it was necessary that, by deeds as well as by words, those things should be foreshadowed, which were in after times to be revealed. After the revelation by Christ and in Christ, the community of believers is not burdened with the practice of the observances, but is admonished to give heed to the prophecy." So in other words, we are warned by the prohibition on eating swine against a way of life in which we do not ruminate on the scriptures. And so this is a good symbolical reading of why it is that some animals are allowed to be eaten and some are not, particularly those that have the divided hoof and those that chew the cud. They provide a symbol for the way of life that the Christian is supposed to have. St. Clement of Alexandria writes also on clean and unclean, Although he has a slightly different interpretation, it is nonetheless a symbolic one, and we'll see what he has to say. Quote, "For such of the sacrifices as part the hoof and ruminate," and I want to note here that ruminate is the same as chew the cud here. Okay, so sacrifices that part the hoof and ruminate. "Such as these," he says, "the Scripture represents as clean and acceptable to God, since the just obtain access to the Father and to the Son by faith. For this is the stability of those who part the hoof, those who study the oracles of God night and day, and ruminate on them in the soul's receptacle for instructions, which Gnostic exercise the law expresses under the figure of rumination of the clean animal. But such as have neither the one nor the other of those qualities it separates as unclean." So, to part the hoof is to study the oracles of God, and to ruminate on them, that is to meditate on them, this is represented by chewing the cud. St. Clement continues, "Now those that ruminate but do not part the hoof indicate the majority of the Jews, who have indeed the oracles of God but have not faith, and the step which, resting on the truth, conveys to the Father by the Son. Whence also this kind of cattle are apt to slip, not having a division in the foot, and not resting on the twofold support of faith." So in other words, the Jews meditate on the Scripture, but they don't know how to study the oracles correctly. They don't know how to part the hoof in the right way. And again, St. Clement continues, "Those are likewise unclean that part the hoof, but do not ruminate. For these point out the heretics, who indeed go upon the name of the Father and the Son, but are incapable of grinding down the clear declaration of the oracles, and who besides perform the works of righteousness coarsely and not with precision, if they perform them at all. To such the Lord says, 'Why will you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things which I say?' And those that neither part the hoof nor chew the cud are entirely unclean." So you have those who part the hoof and those that ruminate or chew the cud and do both correctly. And those are the Christians who seek God through the Christ in faith. You have those that chew the cud but do not part the hoof, that would be the Jews. And then you have those that part the hoof but don't chew the cud, that would be the heretics. And so you've got the Christians in the church who are doing things correctly, and then you've got the Jews and the heretics, according to St. Clement, who are off in one way or the other. This again is another symbolical reading of what is going on with the dietary restrictions as shown to us by the fathers. And it's not about why you should have one animal or another in the physical sense, in the literal sense, but rather it's about what is represented by this. So that's what we have to say on clean and unclean. Let's move forward to chapter 16, the Day of Atonement, arguably the most important day of the Jewish year in ancient Israel, because this is the day of the paradigmatic atonement of the people. Chapter 16, verse 1, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of Aaron's two sons, when they offered strange fire before the Lord and died. And the Lord said to Moses, 'Tell Aaron your brother not to come at just any time into the holy place inside the veil, in the presence of the mercy seat on the ark of the testimony, lest he die. For I will be seen in the cloud above the mercy seat.'" And this kind of looks forward to the notion that this will happen once a year, only on one day, as it is said a little bit later in this chapter. "Thus Aaron shall come into the holy place with a young bull of the oxen as a sin offering, and a ram as a whole burnt offering. He shall put the holy linen tunic and the linen trousers on his body. He shall be girded with a linen sash, and the linen turban and with the linen turban he shall be attired. These are his holy garments. Then he shall take from the congregation of the children of Israel 2 kids of the goats as a sin offering, and 1 ram as a whole burnt offering." Now, the real center of what's going on here is the 2 kids, or the 2 goats. What is going to happen with them? This is chapter 16, verse 8. "Aaron shall cast lots for the 2 kids, 1 lot for the Lord, and the other for the scapegoat. Aaron shall bring the kid on which the Lord's lot fell and offer it as a sin offering. But the kid on which the lot fell to be the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement upon it, to let it go as the scapegoat into the desert." Now, I'm going to say a little bit more about this. I'm going to read just a little bit more. Verse 15. Aaron shall kill the kid of the sin offering before the Lord on behalf of the people and bring some of its blood inside the veil, to do with it as he did with the blood of the young bull, and sprinkle it upon the east side of the mercy seat 7 times. So he shall make atonement in the holy place because of the impurities and injustices of the children of Israel. So there's one kid that is sacrificed, and its blood goes into the Holy of Holies. The other, however, verse 20, when Aaron shall finish making atonement in the holy place, the tabernacle of testimony and the altar, he shall also cleanse matters concerning the priests, and then he shall bring the living kid. Aaron shall place his hands on the head of the living kid, that is the living goat, confessing over it all the transgressions of the children of Israel, and all their lawlessness, and all their sins. And he shall put them on the head of the living kid, and send it away into the desert by the hand of a suitable man. The kid shall bear on itself all their wrongdoings to an uninhabited land. Thus he shall send away the kid into the desert. Then Aaron shall come into the tabernacle of testimony and take off the linen garments he put on when he went into the holy place, and he shall leave them there, and he shall wash his body. Now, there are these 2 goats then, one sacrificed in the temple, the other having all of the transgressions, all of the lawlessness and the sins of Israel placed on it, and it is literally walked into the desert. And so you can imagine yourself as a member of the people of Israel in these ancient times, seeing your sin and the sins of the entire people placed on an animal that is literally then walked off into the horizon. There goes your sin. There goes your guilt before God. It's a really fascinating kind of experience to contemplate. But why 2 goats? Why 2 kids? Why is one sacrificed in the temple and the other one taken off into an uninhabited land? Well, a similar idea is expressed by Tertullian and Theodoret. Theodoret has this to say. He writes regarding these 2 goats. I will, however, mention the sacrifice in which 2 goats were offered, the one being slain and the other let go. In these 2 goats there is an anticipative image of the 2 natures of the Savior. In the one let go, of the impassible Godhead, and in the one slain, of the passible manhood. So on this Day of Atonement, on this high and holy day, this Sabbath of Sabbaths, as we're going to see it be called in just a moment, there is this double dynamic going on with the 2 goats, one slain, one off into the wilderness. And this is a prefiguration of the 2 natures of the Christ. The human nature, the physical nature, which is slain, and the impassible Godhead, which does not die. In the case of ancient Israel, the goat being walked off into the wilderness and its death not being seen. But this looks forward to the great sacrifice on the cross and on the Christ who makes atonement for us in it, in our highest and holiest of sacrifices. Leviticus 16, verse 29. This shall be an ordinance forever for you. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall humble your souls and do no work at all, whether a native of your own country or a resident alien who dwells among you. For on that day the priest shall make atonement for you to cleanse you from all your sins before the Lord. Thus you shall be clean. It is a Sabbath of Sabbaths, a rest for you, and you shall humble your souls. And this shall be done once a year, as we are told. But I want to point out that this Sabbath of Sabbaths, this Day of Atonement, is a day of rest. It is the day in which the people of Israel would humble themselves by not working. That is their humility. That is their wisdom, which is to stop their own work as they remember that it is God that is working. It is God who is cleansing them. God who is purifying them so that they can appear before him. And so we find an interweaving here of notions of wisdom, which are that we are to humble ourselves, and also the holiness of rest. That in fact, it is wise to rest, because wisdom is that which humbles itself by ceasing to work, and so recognizing the ultimate work of God. And we see this on the Day of Atonement that again prefigures the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. Now we're going to move to the larger section that we have remaining here, and this is the Holiness Code, which is chapters 17 through 27. And we're not going to cover every chapter, but we'll go over, I think, some of the main ideas. And I want to recall here the refrain that we've already heard, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." Well, what does this mean? For God to be holy, it means that he is our rest. He is our life. And we shall be holy, ancient Israel and also the church by extension shall be holy, as God is holy. What does this mean? It means that we are to rest in God and provide rest for one another. As God says to Moses, as we saw in Exodus, "I will give you rest," or more literally, "I am your rest." So you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy, means you shall rest in me, we shall rest in God and be separate or set apart for him, but also in our actions, we shall give rest to one another. We shall love one another. And we'll see how this works itself out in these chapters. So in chapter 17, we have descriptions of the sanctity of blood and warnings against idolatry. So, for example, chapter 17, verse 3, "Whatever man of the children of Israel or resident aliens dwelling among them kills a young bull, a sheep or a goat in the camp, or kills it outside the camp, and does not bring it to the door of the tabernacle of testimony to offer it as a whole burnt offering, that person shall have blood reckoned to him. For he has shed blood, and that man shall be utterly destroyed from among his people." And this is a warning against idolatry, because if you have an animal sacrificed or if you've killed a bull, you should do it in the presence of God or recognizing God. As it is said in verse 7, "The Israelites shall no more offer their sacrifices to worthless things after whom they prostituted themselves. This shall be an ordinance forever for you throughout your generation. Also you shall say to them, whatever man of the children of Israel or of the resident aliens who dwells among you offers a whole burnt offering or a sacrifice and does not bring it to the door of the tabernacle of testimony to offer it to the Lord, again, that man shall be utterly destroyed from among his people. Further, whatever man of the children of Israel or of the resident aliens dwelling among you eats any blood, I will set my face against that soul who eats blood and will utterly destroy him from among his people. For the life of all flesh is in its blood, and I give it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your sins, for its blood makes atonement for the soul. You shall not eat the blood of any flesh, for the life of all flesh is its blood. Whoever eats it shall be utterly destroyed." And so there is a strict prohibition against the eating of blood ritually, because the life is in the blood, and the blood is set apart for atonement. And so again, there is a ritual meaning of not eating the blood or drinking blood. But I want to expand that meaning to the moral implication. To not drink or eat the blood of an animal, to not imbibe its life. When we think about that principle and apply it morally to our relationship to others, it means we shall not take the life of another in order to give life to ourselves. We shall not make another feel anguish. We shall not take the labor of another. We shall not subject the other to pain. We shall not take advantage of our neighbor in order to give greater life to ourselves. To sum this up, very simply, we shall not oppress our neighbor for the sake of our own gain. We shall not take the life of those who are near us so that we may derive some advantage or profit thereby. You shall not eat or drink the blood of an animal, for the life is in the blood. Do not take the life of another creature and drink it as if you were simply to arrogate it from them and swallow it for yourself. Nor morally shall you do this to your neighbor. Now, I think that's a good introduction into what is going to follow, because we're going to see in these later chapters love of God, resting in God, and giving rest to the neighbor. We're going to get there, not immediately, but when we get to the latter half of the Holiness Code. The next set of chapters, chapters 18 through 20, work together as a unit. And the theme that ties these together is not behaving like the people who were in Egypt or the people in Canaan. And it's really important to remember this when we think about the broader story that we're in the middle of. We're in the story of the creation of Israel, and that means the people getting to the promised land and ultimately resting there and occupying it. But there are people who are already there, and those people are going to be defeated, if not wholly destroyed. And so in these chapters, what we receive is a rationale for what is going to happen to them. And we'll come back to this when we get to Joshua. But we are told why it is that they are going to be destroyed. What have they done that might warrant this for them? Chapter 18, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. According to the way of life in the land of Egypt where you dwelt, you shall not do. And according to the way of life in the land of Canaan where I bring you, you shall not do. Nor shall you walk in their judgments and ordinances. You shall do my judgments and keep my ordinances to walk in them. I am the Lord your God." And so where you are going, there are people, and those people have lived in a sinful way. You shall not do that. This is the introduction to what's going to follow. And I just want to take a moment here to say that what is going to follow, again, this is one of those moments where you may or may not want children to hear. So if you have small children, you may want to skip over the next couple of minutes while we go over chapters 18 to 20, because there are some commandments of a sexual nature that are going to be discussed here. And if you don't want your younger children to be exposed to that, then you now have your opportunity to step away a little bit for them. So, what are the sins that they are doing, the things that Israel is not to do? Almost all of these have to do with some sort of sexual sin. So, for example, chapter 18, verse 6, "None of you shall approach anyone who is near of kin to him to uncover his nakedness. I am the Lord." And uncover his nakedness is another way of saying to have sex with that person. "The nakedness of your father or mother you shall not uncover. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of your father's wife you shall not uncover. It is your father's nakedness. The nakedness of your sister, the daughter of your father, or the daughter of your mother, whether born at home or elsewhere, her nakedness you shall not uncover." Skipping forward a little bit. "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It is your brother's nakedness." And the general rule here is that you are not to have sex with those who are near of kin to you. To do so is impious, says verse 17. So you shall not have sexual relations with those who are aunts, say, or those who are your sister-in-law, or those who are your mother-in-law, and any of those kinds of people, those who are of near relation to you, you will not have sexual relations with. Also, you shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness as long as she is in her menstrual period of uncleanness. Moreover, you shall not lie carnally with your neighbor's wife to defile yourself with her. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. You shall not mate with any animal to defile yourself with it, nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is perversion. So we have all of these commands that have to do largely with incestual or close family relationships. So we have several commands on that level. Then we also have additional commandments. You shall not have sex with a woman in her menstrual period. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not have homosexual sex. You shall not mate with any animal. All of these things you are to avoid. And again, the rule here, the sort of practical upshot for them, verse 24, "You will not defile yourselves with any of these things, for by all of these ways of life the nations are defiled, which I am casting out before your face. For the land is defiled, and on its account I am repaying them for their wrongdoing. Thus the land became vexed with those dwelling upon it. You shall therefore keep all my ordinance and my judgments, and shall not do any of these abominations, either any of your own nation or any resident alien who dwells among you, that the land not be vexed with you in your defilement of it, as it was vexed with the nations before you." So because of all of these things, because of this kind of behavior, the people that now live in Canaan are going to be destroyed or cast out. And you will take their place. Therefore, do not do as they have done. Now, moving from this chapter to chapter 19, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." This is the refrain that we saw a little bit earlier. "Every one of you shall reverence his father and mother, and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not follow idols, nor make for yourselves molten gods." Reverence your father and mother and keep my Sabbaths. God is saying, rest in him and rest in the patrimony and the heritage that he has given you, most directly your mother and father, who are representative of it. Do not follow idols. Again, rest in God alone. But the big emphasis that we see in this chapter, in chapter 19, is the shift from concerns with sexual morality, largely sexual morality, to concerns of compassion and justice. And we see several commandments that express this. So leave part of your vineyard for the poor. Leave the corners so that the poor may glean it. Do not steal. Do not treat your neighbor unjustly. Nor do you keep the wages of your laborer who has worked for you. You are to be impartial. Don't be partial towards the poor. Don't be partial towards the rich. You are not to hate your brother in your mind. You are to bear no grudges. You are not to take vengeance. And so all of these are ways of showing compassion or being just toward your neighbor. As we see in verse 18, you shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people. And here comes the high point. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And so we have a series of commandments for how we are to treat others, how we are to be just towards them. Again, don't steal. Be impartial. Don't hate your brother in your mind or bear grudges. In other words, don't let your heart harden towards others. Don't harbor thoughts that are hateful towards others. But you are to love your neighbor as yourself. And Christ is asked, what is the great commandment? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. There is a second commandment that is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is where this comes from. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And so there is this marked transition from sexual sins that we saw in chapter 18 to this concern for compassion and justice in chapter 19. Now, interestingly, immediately after the command to love your neighbor as yourself, there is an emphasis on not mixing things that are unlike. So we go from moral commands that are fairly easily applied or understood, rather, in our context. We can understand what is said, we think, by love your neighbor as yourself and by doing no injustice in judgment. We move from there to, and this is verse 19, you shall not let your cattle mate with a different species. You shall not sow your field with mixed seeds, nor shall a garment of mixed linen and wool come upon you. And so we go from love your neighbor to as yourself to do not let your cattle mate with a different species, and don't sow your field with mixed seeds. There's this notion of not mixing things that are unlike. Keep like things together. And the jump here is a bit of a broad one, right? So how do we go from love your neighbor as yourself to don't sow your field with mixed seeds? And it's interesting to think here about how the division between clean and unclean, which is the earlier division that we saw, or like and unlike, maintaining that division, is connected with the ability to love others properly. Perhaps there's something like that that's being implied here. For the rest of the chapter, we see different kinds of commandments. So, for example, when you plant a tree, in the 5th year you may eat its fruit, that it may yield to you its increase. I am the Lord your God. You shall not make any gashing on your bodies for the dead, nor tattoo any marks on you. I am the Lord your God. Do not defile your daughter to cause her to commit fornication, lest the land fall into fornication and the land become full of lawlessness. So again, we see these different kinds of commands. And as opposed to there being a direct focus on justice and compassion, we see a shift to a variety of commands that may or may not fit together with a lot of thematic unity. However, as we move towards the end of the chapter, we see the return to compassion and to justice. Verse 30, you shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my holy things. I am the Lord. You shall rise before the gray-headed and honor the presence of an old man and fear your God. I am the Lord your God. And if a resident alien dwells with you in your land, you shall not mistreat him. You shall do no injustice in judgment, in measurement of length, weight, or balances. You shall have honest scales, honest weights, and honest measures. So there's a return towards the end in treating other people correctly. Even the resident alien you shall not mistreat, and you shall do no injustice in judgment. So the chapter on the whole has to do with justice and with compassion, and with this very important point that is pulled out by the Christ: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is what we see in chapter 19. Now, as I've said, chapters 18 through 20, I think, should be looked at as a unit. So when we come to chapter 20, we're going to see a return, not immediately, but a return to the sexual sins that we saw in chapter 18. So chapter 20 begins with a warning against allowing children to worship a ruler. If anyone allows their children to worship a ruler, they shall be put to death. We see connected with this the same refrain that we've seen a couple of times: therefore you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. You shall keep my ordinances and perform them. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. And so in the beginning, there's this command about not allowing your children to worship rulers, a reiteration of the people being holy, which we have seen now several times in the text. And after this, there is a return to the sexual sins that we saw earlier. The man who commits adultery with another man's wife, or who commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. The man who lies with his father's wife has uncovered his father's nakedness. Both shall surely be put to death, for they are guilty. And what we see here is a series of sins for which the penalty is death. So there is death for adultery, death for sex with your father's wife, death for sex with a daughter-in-law, with another man, with animals, with one's sister, with one's aunt. All of these receive the death penalty. If a man lies with a woman during her menstrual period and uncovers her nakedness, he has exposed her flow, and she has uncovered the flow of her blood. Both shall be utterly destroyed from among the people. And so we see examples here of punishments for these kinds of behaviors. The behaviors were mentioned in chapter 18. You are not to do them. These are abominations. They're very bad. But the punishments are given for them in chapter 20. So there's a return here to the same themes. A kind of summary statement is given in chapter 20, verse 23. You shall not walk in the ordinances of the nations I am casting out before you, for they commit all these things, and therefore I abhor them. But I said to you, you shall inherit their land, and I will give it to you to possess, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God who separated you from all peoples. You shall therefore distinguish between clean animals and unclean. You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord your God, who separated you from all the peoples for myself, am holy. Now, what we have here is a number of themes that are wrapped together. You shall not do these things because the people of the land were doing them, and for this reason they are being cast out. For this reason they will be destroyed. It is their own sin that brings this to them. This is why the destruction in Joshua is going to happen so far as it concerns the behavior of the people who are currently in the land. Again, we'll probably come back to this when we get to Joshua. But in the same breath, just in the next few verses, God says, I am the Lord your God who separated you from all the peoples. You shall therefore distinguish between clean animals and unclean, hearkening back to chapters 11 through 15. Don't forget the dietary restrictions. And you shall be holy to me, again said, as I am holy, for I, the Lord your God, who separated you from all the peoples for myself, am holy. You shall be set apart for God. And being set apart for God means that you do not do these things that the people of the land were doing. And it means that you love your neighbor as yourself. Now, how might we put these chapters together if we see chapters 18 and 20 as a kind of bracket with chapter 19 in the middle? Well, chapter 19 is about properly giving rest to your neighbor. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You shall not take rest away from your neighbor. You shall be impartial. You shall give them their wages. You shall not treat them unjustly. You shall not steal. You shall not hate them in your mind. But you shall be a source of rest for your neighbor. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, I think it's right for us to see that as the highest form of giving rest, to love your neighbor as yourself. Or we might say in the New Testament, to love others as Christ has loved us. But to love your neighbor as yourself is a higher form that we see here. Now, supporting that as a kind of foundation, something that is a stepping stone to the higher, is the rest of familial relations. The rest of a kind of sexual boundary by which people limit themselves. Part of the reason that the people of Canaan were being punished was that life had evidently turned into a kind of sexual free-for-all, and that all the boundaries that we might know civilizationally for most of human history, all of those boundaries had just fallen away. And sexual relations were possible with, it would seem, almost anyone, at least your next of kin. So those types of things had become possible. And we might ask, how can people rest in one another when life has seemed to become a free-for-all for pleasure, in this particular case, sexual pleasure, where every person, it might be judged, is rapacious for what they see as their own indulgence? How can anyone be trusted? How can you rest in anyone? And whatever else sexual ethics may do in the Christian tradition, it provides those boundaries by which people are limited. And when people are limited according to those boundaries, people can trust between one another what they will do and not do, that they will not be betrayed or harmed or oppressed by the behavior of their neighbor, even their nearest of kin. And so these sexual rules provide a kind of basic foundation for how we are to rest in one another in terms of our behavioral expectations. A kind of stepping stone to a greater form of rest, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. Not only are you, say, decent enough not to go off and sleep with your father's wife or sleep with your sister, not only are you decent enough not to do those things, but you take it a step further and you love your neighbor as yourself. But the breakdown among the peoples of Canaan had become so severe that it would seem, based on these commandments, that each one was literally just out for pleasure, however they might be able to find it, and regardless of the consequences for others. If you want to think of social breakdown, which does happen in other places in the Old Testament, but if you want to think about examples of social breakdown, these chapters in Leviticus are a really good place to start. What were the people doing? How could they possibly rest in one another if they were doing these things? How could they possibly love one another if they were doing these things? So this is a way for us to think about how these three chapters work together. Skipping forward to chapter 23, the feasts of the Lord that are discussed. There are three major feasts. There's the Feast of the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, which by the time of Christ was known as Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And what I want to point out here is that the feasts are linked by the emphasis on rest. The emphasis on rest is common throughout them. So chapter 23, verse 3, 6 days work shall be done, but the seventh is a Sabbath rest, a holy convocation to the Lord. You shall do no work on it. Actually, the first mention here, before the feasts proper are mentioned, is the Sabbath. But we move from the Sabbath to Pascha, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no service work on it. On the seventh day there shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no service work. So there is an initial feast of Pascha on which there is no work, and then there's a leave-taking 7 days later. We see in the middle of this chapter, before we get to weeks and tabernacles, we see the Day of Atonement mentioned again. Any soul who is not humbled on that same day shall be utterly destroyed from among his people. Any soul who does any work on that same day, that soul shall be destroyed from among his people. You shall not do any work. It shall be a Sabbath of Sabbaths for you, and you shall humble your souls. The Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of the First Fruits, Feast of the Harvest, Verse 22, you shall proclaim the same day a holy convocation for you. You shall do no service work on it, this feast of the first fruits. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field when you reap, nor shall you gather any gleanings from your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the resident alien. I am the Lord your God. In other words, you shall rest on the holy day, and you shall leave for your harvest some for the poor. The Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no service work on it. Also on the 8th day, it is a final day of the festival for you, and you shall do no service work on it. On the first day there shall be a rest, and on the 8th day there shall be a rest. And so we see this notion of rest mentioned throughout. We see it mentioned on the first and the last day of Pascha, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first and the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths. We see it in the Day of Atonement, which is mentioned in this chapter. It's also mentioned with the New Year in this chapter. You shall have a rest, a memorial of trumpets. We see it mentioned in the discussion of the Feast of Harvest, the Feast of the First Fruits. So in all of these cases, we see rest consistently. You shall rest in God. And this fits very much within the broader theme of the Holiness Code. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And for the people to be holy means that they must rest in God. For God is our rest, and this is what it means for him to be holy to us. Now, not long after this, chapter 25, is the Feast of Jubilee. And this is really one of the most interesting chapters in the Old Testament. The year of remission, also known as the year of Jubilee. You shall also count 7 years of rest for yourself, 7 times 7 years. And the time of the 7 weeks of years shall be to you 49 years. So after 49 years have passed, 7 weeks of years, what then? Then you shall sound the trumpet throughout your land on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the Day of Atonement you shall make the trumpet sound throughout all your land. Then you shall sanctify the 50th year and proclaim remission throughout the land to all its inhabitants. In this year of remission, each shall return to his possession. Also, if you should make a sale of land to your neighbor or buy it from him, let a man not oppress his neighbor. Now, what is going on here when it says each shall return to his possession? Well, this is looking forward to when the people are in the land of Canaan, when they've already occupied it and when each man has been given his allotment. So when each person has been given his allotment, after time, over the passage of time, some people will have good luck, some will have bad luck, some will become wealthy, some will become poor. And at some point, a man might sell his land because he needs to do so in order to get money or to be able to feed himself. But what the year of remission is saying is that in the 50th year, anyone who has sold his land gets to go back to it. He returns to his possession. On the other hand, anyone who has bought the land of others, bought the ancestral possession of another Israelite, that person has to give the land back. Because what is being sold is not actually the land. What is being sold is the number of harvests until the next Jubilee or year of remission. So if it's been 25 years since the last year of remission, and someone becomes so poor that they have to sell their land, they are selling the next 25 years of harvest. They're not selling the land itself. The land belongs to God. As it says here in verse 23, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, says the Lord. For in my sight you are resident aliens and sojourners. The point of this, to get back to the original verses that I read a moment ago, is that a man should not oppress his neighbor. How is it that oppression happens? Oppression happens when rather than having a society which is largely equal, you have a society that is built upon extremes. You have people who are extremely wealthy and people who are extremely poor, because those who are extremely poor are most likely to be oppressed, most likely to be taken advantage of, most likely to feel anguish and not receive their just due for their labor. And so what is happening every 50 years with the year of remission is a reset, so that those who are most likely to do the oppressing, that is, the very wealthy, cease to be as wealthy. And those who are most likely to be oppressed, that is, the very poor, have their possession given back to them. They start over. And so there is a kind of egalitarian reset that happens here. And we don't really know if the Israelites practiced this. They may have practiced it. They may not have. Again, we don't really know. But the principle is to stop the circumstances of oppression from developing and becoming permanent. You shall not oppress your neighbor. This is what we see mentioned here. Now, after this, there are additional commandments. For example, you shall take no usury or interest from the resident alien or of your poor brother, but you shall fear your God, I am the Lord, that your brother may live with you. You shall not lend him your money for usury, nor lend him your food at a profit. Again, you shall not oppress your neighbor. Those who are poor, those who need money, if you're one of the ones who's able to lend it, you don't lend it at a cost, because that oppresses your neighbor. Then there are a handful of commandments with respect to slaves. Now, if your brother with you becomes poor and sells himself to you, that is, sells himself as a slave, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave, but as a hired servant or a sojourner, he shall be with you and shall work for you until the year of remission. I cannot emphasize enough, in Israel, among Israelites, there was no slavery. There was indentured servitude. You could sell yourself to be a slave for a time, but you would be freed. We see in Exodus that you're freed every 7th year, and so it's unsurprising to us that in the year of remission also you would be freed. Then in the remission, he shall depart from you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family. He shall return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my personal servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold with the sale of a household servant. So in other words, you can freely, given your circumstances, sell yourself into slavery, that is, indentured servitude, in ancient Israel. But after the time has finished, you will go back to your land. Or after the 7th year, as we saw in Exodus, you will have your freedom. The point here being, verse 43, you shall not overwork your neighbor with labor, but you shall fear the Lord your God. Or again, in verse 46, regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not overwork him with labor. You shall not tyrannize him with force. You shall not give him more work. You shall give him rest. Your neighbor whom you possess for the time, who has sold himself to be your indentured servant, you shall ensure that he has rest. And when he leaves, he will take his children with him. Even those who sell themselves to the resident alien among you, you shall have your eye on your brother Israelite, who is the servant of the resident alien. The one who is the servant shall be with the resident alien as a hired servant year by year, and you shall not allow someone to overwork him with labor in your sight. You shall not oppress with labor. You shall ensure that all of those among you have rest. Verse 55, for the children of Israel are personal servants to me. They are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. When we look at the connection between chapter 23 and chapter 25, we see in chapter 23 that the people are to rest in God. Here are all the feast days. Here are all the times that you rest. And then in chapter 25, just a little bit after that, we see how you are to give rest to your neighbor. And the year of remission, the year of Jubilee, is there as a protection or a guard against oppression, that one may not oppress the other, whether through taking wealth all to oneself and oppressing those who are poor, or the oppression of the slave. But we are told many times when it comes to slavery, and again, I say slavery, but really what we mean here is indentured servitude, something that is limited by time. The relationship that the owner is to have to the servant is not to overwork him with labor, not to be harsh. As it's said in other translations, you shall not treat one another with harshness in this chapter. But regarding your brethren, you shall not oppress with labor. Or to put it in other terms, you shall ensure that they have what is holy. You shall ensure that they have rest. Now also in these chapters, I want to make sure that we mention In chapter 25, just before the discussion of the remission, or the year of Jubilee, there is the commandment that the land also shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. So it's not only that the people and the animals rest on the 7th day, it's that the land rests in the 7th year. Everything is supposed to rest. Rest is holy. Rest is the source of life as God gives for all the people. And so all of the creation takes part in it. Lastly, chapter 26 discusses blessings for obedience and punishments for disobedience. Now you shall not make handcrafted objects for yourselves, neither a carved image nor a pillar shall you rear up for yourselves, nor shall you set up a distinctive stone in your land to worship it, for I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my holy things. I am the Lord. This is the beginning of the chapter. You shall keep my Sabbaths. You shall rest in me. You shall reverence my holy things, or some translations say you shall reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. So what are the good things that happen if the people are obedient? You shall eat your bread to the full and dwell in your land safely. The land shall yield its produce. You will have rain in season. The trees of the field shall bear their fruit. So you will have prosperity in the land. You will also have no war and victory over your enemies. But perhaps the most important, chapter 26, verse 12, God says, I will walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. This is known as the covenant formulary. I will be your God, you shall be my people. But here, I will walk among you. The presence of God will be with the people. This is the supreme blessing. If you humble yourself before God, the wisdom tradition teaches us, he will honor you. And that honor is the presence of God. He will be with us. He will walk among us. And this is what is promised to the people of ancient Israel. On the other hand, with the punishments, if you disobey, you will endure the withering away of your life. You shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it. I will set my face against you, and you shall fall before your enemies. Your strength shall be spent in vain, for your land shall not yield its produce. And I will walk in hostility to you, and I will strike you 7 times for your sins. So your way of life in the land will not be prosperous, and your labor and your energy will be spent in vain. And when you go to war, you will fall before your enemies. There are even mentions of cannibalism here that look forward to the invasion of Babylon, when Babylon invades and destroys Jerusalem. Verse 29, I will chastise you 7 times for your sins, then you shall eat the flesh of your sons and daughters. I will make desolate your pillars, and I will utterly destroy your wooden handcrafted objects, that is, your idols. I will lay your cities waste and bring your holy things to desolation. Now, in the next few verses, we see the opposite of God dwelling with the people in the land. So what's the opposite? What's the counterpoint to this? God says in verse 33, I will scatter you among the Gentiles, and the sword shall suddenly destroy you. Then your land shall be a desert, and your cities deserts. Then the land shall enjoy its Sabbaths as long as it lies desolate, and you are in your enemy's land. Thus the land shall rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. As long as it lies desolate, it shall rest, for the time it did not rest on your Sabbaths when you dwelt in it. Now there's a fascinating connection in both the rewards for obedience and the punishments for disobedience between God, the people, and the land. Remember, the land is the place where the people are supposed to be. When God creates something, he creates a place for it, and it is supposed to go there and rest in its place. But resting in the land and resting in the God are intimately woven together. If you rest in God and humble yourself before him, then you will rest in the land, and he will be there with you in the land. But if you do not humble yourself before God, if you do not rest in him, but if you go your own way, then you will not rest in the land, and the land itself will still have the rest that God intended for it. I will scatter you among the Gentiles, and the sword shall suddenly destroy you. Being scattered in the Old Testament is, generally speaking, a bad thing. It is the people at the Tower of Babel who are scattered because of their pride. And here, the Israelites will be scattered if they turn from God. They will be exiled, which is what happens both with the coming of the Assyrians and later with the coming of the Babylonians. You will be taken out of the land that is your place. And the land at that point shall enjoy its Sabbaths as long as it lies desolate and you are in your enemy's land. Because the rest that it is to have, it will have. Remember what was said about the people of Canaan who were disobedient. The land is vexed at them. So the land itself is either with us or against us, depending on whether or not we have humbled ourselves before God, who has given us that land and who has made the land to have rest, as all creation rests. I want to close here with a quote from St. Caesarius of Arles on "Be holy as I am holy." Here's what he says on the exhortation that we should be holy. "Pious souls of the Lord, what the Lord admonishes us is not to be considered merely in passing, for he says, 'Be holy because I am holy.' Although this term properly belongs to all the Christian people, according to what Blessed Peter says, 'You, however, are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation,' this term seems particularly to apply to all priests in a special way. In all the letters which are addressed to the Lord's priests by any men whatsoever, it is specially indicated that they are holy. Since then this term is applied to us, we ought to inquire what precisely is its meaning. It is only through Greek that the interpretation of this word holy can be discovered. For hagios is the Greek holy, and hagios has the meaning not of the earth. Therefore, if we are more solicitous for heavenly things than for those of earth, this term is not unfittingly applied to us. And for us," this is me talking now, "for us to be more solicitous of heavenly things than for those of earth, it is to seek our rest in God." Would that we could do this regularly. Seek our rest in God, not our rest in the things of the world, and therefore be holy to Him. See you all next time.
The Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua with Dr. Daniel Cantey. Dr. Cantey taught religion and philosophy at Bethel University from 2012 to 2019. He is a graduate of Yale Divinity School and Emory University and lives with his family in Clarksville, Tennessee. This has been a listener and viewer-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.